The Growth Agenda, Unlocking British Abundance. So what happened to growth, and how do we get it back? It has become fashionable, almost a mark of intellectual sophistication, to believe that the United Kingdom is in a state of irreversible decline. We are told that we have reached the limits of growth, that our ageing infrastructure, crumbling services, and stagnant wages are simply the new normal for a maturing economy. But if you look at the hard data, this stagnation isn't an inevitable law of nature. It's a policy choice. Since the global financial crisis in 2008, the UK has hit a wall. If the British economy had simply maintained the growth trend it enjoyed between 1990 and 2007, the average person in this country would be 40% better off today than they currently are. This is the prosperity gap, the difference between the life we are living and the life we were promised. Is it any surprise that ordinary people in this country are discontented with the status quo? By contrast, the average American is only 12% behind where they would be if the US's 1990 to 2007 trend continued. The average Australian is 22% behind. The average German is only 14% behind. In fact, the UK's foregone growth after 2008 is by far the largest in the English-speaking world and the G7. The 2008 crash hit us harder than most for two reasons. Firstly, the British economy was uniquely dominated by the financial sector in 2007. Since the Glorious Revolution, the City of London has been outsized relative to the British economy. This was reinforced by Margaret Thatcher's Big Bang, which set the British financial industry free to compete and win internationally. This means that a sector-specific shock to the financial industry hit the United Kingdom harder than any other major economy, almost by design. Secondly, and more importantly, the British economy was less able to reorient itself towards the new world order that arose after the crisis. Our planning system was too inflexible, our energy prices were too high, and our tax system was too badly designed for the economy to adapt. It's this where our policy choices come in. So, restoring economic growth matters. Why? Well, there are three reasons. Firstly, because it will improve the living standards of ordinary British people who have been stuck on roughly stagnant real wages since about 2007. Secondly, a sustained increase in economic growth will also make it affordable for the United Kingdom to meet the overwhelming wave of social obligations that are coming due as the population ages. As a paper we released last month shows, on current policies and trends, Britain's net public sector debt will rapidly become unsustainable. Growth is absolutely necessary to avoid this calamity. And thirdly, because it is only with growth that we will be able to afford the necessary improvements to core public services. These are policing, transport, infrastructure, and defence. And we can do that without punishingly high taxes that dampen the rest of the economy even more. We at the Adam Smith Institute think the United Kingdom is ready for radical change. The parallels with the 1970s are unavoidable. An energy crisis has once again brought into stark relief this country's gradual relative decline compared to our traditional peers. So are we ready for another Thatcher revolution? In this video, we will present a blueprint for breaking down the barriers that are currently constraining growth. A recent paper of ours identified 14 specific policy barriers that are strangling the British private sector. These are not minor administrative issues, but fundamental blocks on wealth creation. Removing them offers a size of the prize worth an additional 10 to 20% of GDP. That's a lot. This translates to an extra £428 billion for our economy by 2036, which means £5,800 extra per head. The planning cage. Space as a solved problem. The single biggest barrier to British prosperity is the planning system, which governs how houses and property get built. Reforming this could improve our economic growth by over 7%. So, since the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, we have operated on what's called a discretionary planning model. In most successful economies, if you own land and follow a set of clear, predefined rules, you have a right to build. But in Britain, you have to ask for permission, and that permission can be denied for almost any reason, or no reason at all. It's because of this planning system that Britain doesn't build enough homes. We are currently short somewhere between 4.3 and 6.5 million of them. Obviously, that means rents go up, causing misery for those unlucky enough not to own their own home or live in social housing. But it also cuts productivity. High housing costs act as a giant invisible tax on labour mobility. For example, if a brilliant engineer from Newcastle wants to move to a high productivity firm in London or Cambridge, but can't afford the rent, the whole country loses. So we are effectively trapping our most talented people in the wrong places. But the 1947 Act was just the beginning. Over the decades, we have layered on what can only be described as a Vetocracy, a system designed to let everyone say no to development. Take what's called nutrient neutrality. To protect water catchments from a tiny fraction of runoff, the government has blocked the construction of 145,000 homes. And that's despite the fact that the vast majority of nutrient runoff actually comes from agriculture, not housing. Then there's what's called biodiversity net gain, a rule that requires developers to prove that they are increasing a site's biodiversity by 10%. While it sounds noble, it currently delays 92% of developers with expensive, bureaucratic surveys that add months to every project. Perhaps the most invisible barrier is something called the Aarhus Convention. This international agreement allows almost any individual or protest group to file a judicial review against a development project while having their own legal costs capped. It has turned our courts into a weapon for delay. A single objector can stall £1 billion road, rail project, or housing site for years at virtually no cost to themselves, whilst the developer and the taxpayer foot the bill for the inflation and the lost time. So, to unlock economic growth through Britain's planning system, we need something radical. We need to repeal the Town and Country Planning Act and replace it with something new, a Land Use and Development Act that moves us to a consent and compensate model. If you want to build, the default should be yes, so long as you compensate anyone who is too adversely affected. To get Britain building again, we need to let Britain build at all. To have a first world economy, you need first world energy. But the UK currently has the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world. Our prices have tripled in real terms since 2004. High energy prices are a hidden tax on every single product made in Britain. They are the reason our steel and chemical industries are facing an existential crisis. If energy is expensive, manufacturing becomes impossible. This is a direct consequence of policy choices that have prioritised intermittent energy, like wind and solar, over reliable power that is either always on or can be switched on when needed, things like nuclear power and natural gas. Because we can't always rely on the wind to blow, we still need to keep gas available as a backup. But gas power stations aren't free. They cost millions of pounds to operate every year, even if they don't run at all. And because they are lying unused most of the time and not selling their electricity, we have to cover those costs in some way. Part of that comes from exceptionally high prices when gas is used. The rest is covered by what is called the capacity market, where power stations are paid just to stay on standby without producing any energy. These capacity payments are already more than £1 billion a year and will rapidly climb over the next 5 years. At the same time as paying millions to gas power stations to be available, we are paying billions of pounds to windmills, only not to run. This is because we pay the same price for electricity whether it is generated in the deepest oceans off Scotland or right next to where the energy is wanted, like the southeast. What this means is there is no incentive for generators to locate themselves next to demand, or for big industrial users to locate next to where energy is generated. The result is abundant power that we cannot use or rely on, and yet the government keeps funding more and more wind turbines with your money. So, if we want to stop relying on unreliable wind, we will need nuclear power. Unfortunately, our nuclear sector is subject to government-inflicted paralysis. The UK nuclear industry operates under a rule for risk management called ALARP, which stands for as low as reasonably practicable. It sounds sensible, but in practice, it forces nuclear reactors to chase an impossible level of zero risk at increasingly astronomical costs. Instead, nuclear power needs to be treated like every other energy source and have clear safety guidelines that you either pass or fail. We spend billions to save lives that are not statistically at risk, making our nuclear plants the most expensive in history. For example, Hinkley Point C required 7,000 design changes just to satisfy the British regulator, using 35% more steel than the exact same reactor design built in France. What we are essentially doing here is forcing every new project to be a first-of-its-kind experiment, rather than using proven designs. That's why Hinkley Point C is now the second most expensive building in the entire world. I mean, second only to the Grand Mosque of Mecca. To fix Britain's energy crisis and unlock around 4.25% in GDP, we must end the subsidies for intermittent power that drive up bills. We also need to move to clear statutory safety limits for nuclear and, also crucially, automatically recognise reactor designs from trusted allies like France and South Korea. Because if a reactor is safe enough for Seoul or Paris, it should be safe enough for London. Finally, we should pay generators and charge customers the true cost of electricity by introducing what's called nodal electricity prices. It's a tried and tested model used in New Zealand, Singapore, and across the United States. We could also unlock another 0.5 percentage point of GDP by reinvigorating our North Sea oil and gas industry. We share the North Sea reserves with the Norwegians, but unlike them, we have not gradually wound down our fossil fuel sector. Instead, we have pushed it off a cliff, with restrictions on new licenses and punishing windfall taxes. All the way back in 2010, the Norwegians produced a little less than twice as much as us from their section of the North Sea. Today, they produce 5 times as much. So if we recovered that lost ground, we could produce an extra 455 million barrels of oil a year by 2030, compared to current forecasts at least. That is 50% more than Venezuela's total production today. So this wouldn't change the UK's emissions or power prices by that much. Whether or not it is our own product, Britain will continue to need oil and gas into the future, and the price will still be set by the global market, of which the UK will only ever really be a small part. But producing it ourselves will make us more secure in where we get our energy, and richer from when we sell it on those same global markets. The tax on investment. Stop punishing builders. The third major barrier is a tax system designed to punish people for building things. If a British firm wants to build a new factory, they can only write off about 39% of that cost in the first year. In contrast, the OECD average is 49%, and in countries like Estonia or the United States, that figure is often 100%. This simply makes the UK a less attractive place to deploy capital. And then we have stamp duty, a tax on moving house. It is one of the most economically damaging taxes in existence, because it discourages people from moving to take a better job or downsizing when their circumstances change. It gums up the entire housing market. So we want to replace stamp duty and council tax with what's called a proportional land value tax. This is a tax that encourages the efficient use of land rather than penalising you for improving it. If we allow full expensing for all business investment, allowing firms to deduct the full cost of all new equipment or buildings immediately, we could unlock another 1.25% GDP prize. This also applies to the tax traps in our personal system. At £100,000 a year, earners face an effective marginal tax rate of over 60% as their personal allowance is withdrawn. This causes a massive spike in the data where people refuse pay rises or work fewer hours just to stay below the threshold. We are literally taxing people for being successful, and that needs to change. rebuilding the City of London. Finally, any recovered British economy will need a reinvigorated financial sector. That is because credit is a massive piece of the growth puzzle. Bank of England research is clear. Credit shortages after the 2008 financial crisis explained up to half of Britain's lost GDP between 2008 and 2012. That's hardly surprising. When borrowing gets harder, businesses can't invest, long-term growth stalls, and then we all lose. Today, the cost of credit remains high relative to the Bank of England's base rate. Why is that? Well, overly risk-averse government policy is largely to blame. Post-crisis regulations gave us a complex web of capital, leverage, and liquidity rules, the kind of system where banks spend more time on regulatory arbitrage than on actually lending to British businesses. The result of this is predictable. Banks are playing it safe, piling their money into low-risk mortgages and government debt, and pulling back from the higher risk but crucial business lending that actually drives the economy. The 2008 financial crisis was, by every stretch, an absolute disaster. But rules focusing solely on UK lending standards wouldn't have stopped banks like Northern Rock and RBS from failing. Those were about wholesale funding collapses and unwise international expansion. So what Britain needs to do is avoid an implicit policy of zero bank failures and recognise that stability alone cannot be the only objective. Our recommendation is simple. We should allow banks to take on more risk, provided they are open and honest about it, and their investors, and not the taxpayer, bear the cost. A 1% drop in the cost of credit could boost our long-run GDP by 1.1%. That's a serious prize, and the government should immediately commission a study into how our current regulatory maze is stifling finance for UK businesses. The second area for reform is the colossal cost of financial crime compliance, mostly driven by anti-money laundering rules, also known as AML. This isn't a small problem. Britain's financial crime rules cost our institutions over £38 billion to administer in 2023 alone. This is a staggering amount. It is more than 4 times what the Home Office spends on all other policing combined. We are applying an extraordinarily large and disproportionate amount of resources to a single class of crime, and the data suggests it's not even that effective. In contrast, one study estimated that the cost of each conviction secured through AML in America is over $7 million. Beyond the cost to banks, these rules are actively damaging the wider economy. They force a practice called de-risking, where banks simply refuse to deal with certain sectors or applicants, leading to more than 11% of business bank account applications being declined by the middle 50% of banks surveyed. If we could reduce the compliance costs by just 15%, that's a £6 billion annual gain for UK entities. The UK is a leading global financial centre and already highly compliant with international standards. We have room to manoeuvre. It's time we used our leverage to argue for a sensible liberalisation of these rules and stop punishing legitimate businesses and individuals with regulatory overkill. The choice: engineering abundance. We have covered just 4 of the most important areas, but the growth agenda also includes recommendations for aviation, the labour market, and trade policy. If you want to read those and find out more details about the areas covered in this video, go to our website. The growth agenda isn't just a list of minor tweaks. It's a total reimagining of the British state's relationship with the economy. But crucially, it is achievable. It identifies 14 specific barriers that any government could take down, with only a little political courage and a lot of detailed policy work. As the famous economist Paul Krugman once said, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. A country's ability to improve its standard of living depends entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker. And don't forget the prize we're fighting for. These reforms would mean an extra £5,800 for every person in the country by 2035. That is the difference between a nation arguing over the scraps and a nation with the resources to fund its future. If a third of this additional GDP was taken in tax revenue, the government would gain £141 billion, or £113 billion in today's money. For example, that could cover twice the annual defence budget, or the capital cost of 27 new aircraft carriers. It could cover the annual employment costs for over 1.9 million new Metropolitan Police Constables. It could fund 251 extra days of NHS spending. Or it could cover over 10,000 additional miles of flat road every single year. And more importantly, it would also deliver the first sustained increase in household living standards in decades. We reckon that real household disposable income could grow by £2,900 per head, or £6,815 for an average household of over 2 people. That is enough to cover an average household's food, restaurant, and alcohol bill for more than an entire year. So, what's the hold-up? After watching this, hopefully you know a little bit more about why the UK is where it is today and what we can do about it.